Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to what is... Ooh, okay, that was almost very bad. But hello everyone and welcome to what is going to be another verdict. I am SpraynPray1000 and today I'm going to be talking about Star Wars Battlefront 2, which is the latest in the EA-run Battlefront series of Star Wars games. I kind of want to just cut right into it. Let me just give the TLDR about this game, right? Similar to 2 years ago when they first introduced Star Wars Battlefront 1 as the de facto reboot / remake of the Star Wars Battlefront series, you know, for the modern era and, you know, the whole Disney acquisition and timeline. Battlefront 2 is essentially the same thing done, except this time around for the upcoming movie The Last Jedi. So as opposed to before, where we had the whole idea that they were going to release DLC to tie in to Episode 7 of Star Wars, which was at the time the up-and-coming. It was coming out like a month or so after the game dropped. This time around we have, in the similar sort of way, Episode 8 coming out, and they have released DLC and such for that. But I just want to cover the base game. Even though, for what I'm going to talk about, this is after I've played the Resurrection campaign for Battlefront 2, which is free story DLC that further expands the story of blah, blah, blah. So I actually want to start off this time around. I want to talk about the multiplayer first. Plainly put, and I'm going to try to concisely summarize this, the multiplayer of Star Wars Battlefront is a load of hot ass for a lot of reasons, and it's actually kind of slim. Well, not it's the opposite of slim pickings, but it's actually kind of hard to even really begin to see where to start with. I think one of the biggest problems I have with Battlefront 2's multiplayer comes from the lack of balancing amongst the heroes, the lack of balancing amongst the weapons, the lack of balancing amongst the maps. It's hard to even really think to begin. You know what? Where to even begin with it? Like, what do you hit on first? Do you hit on the fact that a lot of weapons across a lot of different classes range from either useless to game-breaking, like the Blurg or the NT-242? Do we talk about the weapons that are absolute shit and just move on from that? Do we talk about the fact that the maps have some of the most poor balancing I've ever seen from an EA game or from any multiplayer game in general? I know that a lot of times for Gears of War was pretty simple. They would just essentially to run it down very poorly. What a lot of games do, you know, StarCraft kind of does this, is they make half the map and then they essentially mirror it for the other side, and Gears does that. COD, you know, COD has its sides of maps that are good or bad, but nothing I've ever played in my life compares to how poorly designed some of the maps of Battlefront 2 are. Between the spawns that you can literally get sniped from on Hoth, and the fact that the objectives are sometimes range from super easy to complete to impossible to complete. And of course, this could all be patched later, but from the amount of gameplay that I played, I never once was able to destroy an MTT. That never happened. It is a very rare element, I would even say, that it does happen. And one of the big problems I think that I have with Battlefront 2 is that there just doesn't seem to be any care. There doesn't seem to be any balancing. And that's very apparent from the moment you start playing this multiplayer. There doesn't really seem to be any semblance of balancing. It just seems like, well, what can we throw in as de facto fun and de facto good stuff to do, and what's fun and what isn't, and just, that's it. Just move on from there. And unfortunately, that's the problem I have with this game, is that there doesn't seem to be any care. There doesn't seem to be any love. There doesn't seem to be any reason for you or for them to really put it in, other than just the fact that they were going to plug and chug out another licensed movie tie-in game. And while Star Wars is like a pseudo-movie tie-in, because the emphasis is definitely on the multiplayer, you know, that'll play into effect later. And I just want to really drill that home, that probably out of the 10 or so maps that are in this game, I would only even begin to roughly say that maybe 2 or 3 of them are remotely balanced. And that, you know, this is on top of the other issues that the game has, such as the weapons, the fact that the game locks up all the time for some reason, I don't know. And that's another thing. In addition to server issues, the game suffers from a lot of technical glitches. So, for instance, they have binoculars on the recon class that are supposed to show you where people are through walls, and just for sometimes in some games they will just work or not work with no real determinate frequencies. So sometimes they'll work and it'll be great because you'll be able to see who you're trying to kill and, you know, just see where your enemies are. And sometimes they just won't work the whole game. And it's really kind of a mess to me in the sense that I don't understand how it ended up like this, and I don't understand exactly why, other than, and quite put simply, incompetence. Just a lack of caring. And I want to try to approach this as fair as possible, just from the perception that, well, I don't want to sit here and say that, you know, this is another slop job by EA, but they sure as fuck didn't really make it too hard for me to come to that conclusion. I'll say that much at the bare minimum. I think it is. I think it's just absolute incompetence. I don't see why there would be any reason for these characters and these maps to be, or not characters, excuse me. These, well, if we want to talk about heroes, and that's sort of another thing, but these weapons and these maps and just the game itself to fundamentally not run as well. I mean, you've had games like Battlefield 4, which had a lot of problems at launch. There were games like Hardline, which in my opinion was one of the best running Battlefield games. You know, virtually very few technical issues with that. Visceral polished that to a mirror shine. And then 3 and 4, you know, they had their issues. Bad Company had some issues, but the point is that the games were at least, you know, reasonably playable on launch. This game, I would almost argue, was unplayable on launch. It was very bad. It was very poor between the balancing, the fact that there was a staggered launch between people who pre-ordered the special Black Trooper edition, whatever, that, you know, if you really loved the game so much, then you would have gotten it. That to me, there's just a lot of problems with it. And for this to be the, you know, the definitive next-gen type of a deal, and especially since they already released a game like this, they released, you know, the original, it makes no sense to me why they would have struggled to basically make this game do basic stuff. Like, this game is not a technological masterpiece. It's not an eye-popper. It's not like, you know, we could say, oh, well, it's Doom, you know, it runs 1080-60, and it, at the time, at least, that was significant of Doom. You know, this game is not breaking any benchmarks or you know, ridiculously striving to set some new records. I mean, it's basically carving out stamping grounds, you know what I mean? Like, it's basically the typical type of deal you get from a multiplayer first-person shooter game. And for them to struggle this much and just making it happen says a lot to me. It really speaks that this is not a very quality game. It's not a very quality product. And that is somewhat alarming, in my opinion. I don't see how that's possible. But moving beyond that, the multiplayer is complete ass. I do like the modes. Like, Galactic Assault is your basic mode. It's essentially a mixed bag of game modes on a variety of maps. Excuse me, not game modes, objectives on various maps. So, for instance, and this time, unlike the first game, you know, to their credit, the game does have multiple eras. As we know, Star Wars is traditionally defined by its 3 different eras. You have the prequel trilogy set during the Clone Wars, which is your typical de facto sort of a deal. You see that a lot. You have your original trilogy dealings between the Empire and the Galactic, excuse me, and the Rebellion. And then now you have your First Order versus Resistance, a la Episode 4. And I'll get back to, did I say Episode 4? That is actually a Freudian slip. A la Episode 7, which is essentially Episode 4. But I will get back to that in due time. In a reasonable amount of time, of course. And I like that. I like it a lot. Unfortunately, what it boils down to is reskins. There's not really anything particularly special done with any of these. You play as the same 4 generic units. As of the time of review, or, you know, well, I think now, it might be out now, but as of the base game from when I played, the game had no customization. Essentially, you played as the same characters over and over and over again. There was no way to differentiate, and I feel like a lot of the characters are essentially reskins, maybe wearing a helmet, maybe wearing clone trooper armor. So, for instance, the Resistance as a sniper, because that's predominantly what I played, the Resistance has a Asian female as their default unit, Again, you can't customize gender, you can't customize race, you can't customize looks, you can't customize anything. These people have never heard of a customization slider, apparently. But you can't do that. The Rebels have an Asian female, and also the Resistance does as well. So it's essentially the same character. There's nothing really different. I believe that the Empire and the what is it called? The First Order also have a female as their sniper. And I would almost have to look into whether or not they are the same voice-acted character or not. I don't know. I don't particularly tend to look back and want to do it. There's no variation between the units. It is nice to see the clones and nice to see how nice the generic trooper units look. I think that that's pretty cool. I think that that's something that's done really well. But there's no customization here, so there's 0 points I can give for any sort of uniqueness or customization between all that. What else? The balance is completely off, so the multiplayer is just terrible. The technological aspects of this game are completely in the fucking toilet, so there's nothing redeemable there. So all in all, I mean, I will say I did have fun on some of the maps. I did like playing through some of it, even if some of the objectives, like destroying the troop transports or the AT-ATs, are just fundamentally impossible. But it was nice to see, you know, some return to form with some Rush-type gameplay. Galactic Assault is essentially Rush. There's no real conquest, per se, in this game. Essentially, there's an attacking team, and then there's a defending team, and the defending team has to, you know, defend whatever objective, be it a point, be it a thing that they need to capture or fire against the troop transports, be it some sort of node that needs to have a bomb defused if it gets planted. You know, very, very simplistic stuff. You've seen it before. I'm not faulting them for, you know, not redefining everything, if you know what I mean. But, yeah, no, definitely in regards to that, I think that that's a little lame. And the basicness of the multiplayer is kind of accented by the fact that, well, I mean, there's not really anything too ridiculous, and then it also suffers from a lot. It runs poorly, as I said, and I think that that's a big detriment to this game, especially given the production value, given the team, given the subject matter in question, and given the fact that this is not the first or second Battlefront. They had a lot of stuff to draw on. The other game modes, I did like, I believe it's Strike, because I just find that the smaller the amount of people, the better. I think that the game runs a little bit better when there's less people, which is ironic, because, you know, in a Battlefield type of situation, you want as many people. But this game is fundamentally busted, so there's not really too much credit I can give to it for that. So yeah, the multiplayer is far and few between one of the lesser game modes, and ironic because that's actually the main kind of meat of the game. So what else? I mean, arcade mode is your typical type of stuff. You play, you pick your heroes. It's basically like single-player, multiplayer, although you can play it cooperatively. I mean, there's not really much credit to give here. They didn't really redefine the wheel. They didn't even really try to innovate it or make it something different or even appear different. It is essentially what you would expect from a typical game. And then the only other mode in this game is campaign mode. Now, unlike Battlefront 1, there is a campaign in this game. So I'm just going to summarize this right here as this game has a campaign mode. It's better than nothing, but the campaign mode doesn't add anything. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's one of the lesser campaigns I've played out of first-person shooter campaigns. And I just want to say this now while I am thinking about it, while I just want to throw this out there. There will be some minor spoilers, some various spoilers, and I just want to get that out there. So if you don't want to be spoiled on either the campaign or Episode 7, then please, you know, just stop here. There will be a link in the description for if you want to just come back when I'm actually scoring the game. So I just want to, you know, let that ride for a minute. Just remember that now is your, you know, your final chance to jump off. Okay, so now that everyone who didn't want to hear that is gone, let's get into the nitty-gritty. So to understand why the campaign of Battlefront 2 is so subpar and just so forgettable, you have to understand the type of storyline that they are running with for the Star Wars franchise now. You have to understand essentially why Episode 7 is a bad movie. You have to understand why, and this might turn into a bit of a critique about Episode 7 in particular, but you have to understand that Episode 7 is a movie that, in my opinion and a lot of people's opinions, does not really stand on its own as either a movie nor a sequel, which is bad and very problematic for a movie of the same type of... with this much value behind it, this much history, this much source material. And that's a problem. So the campaign of Battlefront 2 takes place immediately during and following up after Episode 6. So in Episode 6, you know, again, like I said, spoilers, but again, Episode 6 is a very old movie. You play as Eden Versio, or Iden Versio, I never remember which one it is, was part of Inferno Squadron, which is an elite unit of stormtroopers that essentially do wet work for the Galactic Empire. You start off as Eden Versio, you're captured, you're fighting against the rebels, and essentially, spoiler alert, the story isn't what it seems. You flip sides in one of the most pathetic and uninspiring reasons to change sides I've ever seen in a film or a video game. And it's the same sort of thing that's echoed in Episode 7, where Finn decides that after the first naughty thing that the First Order ever asked him to do, he wanted to change sides immediately. He defected, essentially, and became a good guy and became a hero instead of a villain. Why? Never really explained. Not in either Eden's case and neither in Finn's case. It just kind of casts Finn as an idiot, in my opinion, that he had no clue what the First Order was doing. Because it's very clear that he wasn't really too disturbed until he got down and people were dying and there was blood. Apparently, from all intents and purposes, he was very good at what he did, and Phasma took note, and Phasma being some head honcho, who is really not that important in the grand scheme of things because they just never wrote her in as being important for whatever fucking reason. She apparently thought he was really good or some shit. I don't really remember. It wasn't a very well-constructed plot line in the grand scheme of the story. But apparently he works janitorial, and also he serves in the army. I never really explained how that juxtaposition was worked out. But I'm not a fan of the whole turncoat methodology. And you know this if you watch the playthrough. I don't like the idea, and I know that a lot of games I like do this, but I don't really like the idea that both Finn and Eden essentially jumped ship at the first naughty and morally questionable thing that the Empire made them do. Especially Eden, you know, because she is supposed to be a part of this elite squadron that are handpicked for their ruthlessness and their ability to follow through with dirty orders. And for her to question orders and suddenly swap sides at the first morally objectable thing, either they don't really do a good job of picking it, and her partner is essentially chasing the puss at one point. So I don't know. He doesn't really defect for any clearly defined reason other than a meeting with Luke Skywalker that I humorously joked to as a love meeting. But they essentially defect. They go to the rebels. Wow. Never saw that coming. You know, not even an iota of something different. It's the most bare bones, threadbare writing. It is two-dimensional in almost every conceivable angle. The bad person was bad, now they're good, now we're supposed to love them. And there's no motive. It really defines Finn as a turncoat who doesn't really stand for any morals in my book. And it also kind of just perplexes me with Eden. It doesn't really make much sense that she would want to do that. But whatever. Gameplay-wise, the only thing I can say about the campaign is that on a basic level, it functions better than the multiplayer. It has no skips, no nothing. The campaign works, for lack of a better phrase and a lack of a better word. So there's not really too much to say to that. It functions. I mean, sure. If you wanna give credit to a game for functioning, I mean, sure, it does. Whoopee, you know, whatever. So the story completely perplexes me throughout it because I don't find anything that they're doing to be congruent with what the character I was introduced to nor the way that they promote it. I understand, you know, games get promoted wrongly all the time. I have speculations about the plot of Black Ops 2 being changed heavily. We know that Mass Effect Andromeda was a bait and switch. We know a lot of stuff. Metal Gear Solid 2 was an intentional bait and switch. Whatever, right? Maybe you say that. But even within the context of the actual material I'm talking about, it doesn't really make much sense. Why does Eden feel the need to betray them at the first sign of things gone bad? And then why does the campaign become a generic good guy shooter thing? The only nice thing I will give to the campaign is the Starfighter missions. I think that the Starfighter missions are actually really fun. They might be bland, they might be pretty quick, but at least they play really nicely. It's something different, because otherwise the basic infantry gameplay is what you're used to. And there's a minor stealth element to this game. It's nowhere even close to the likes of Battlefield Hardline, and it can't draw a candle to it, in my opinion. It's frankly very piss poor. There's no real difference. You know, there's no marked up rank in difficulty within, you know, of course, the scope of the difficulty setting. You know, in Hardline there was an emphasis on wanting to interrogate people and arrest people, you know, stealthily take them down, you know, to sneak into something maybe. And of course there were action sequences, but it was very understandable why you would want to do that. I mean, you could shoot your way through the whole campaign if you wanted to, but you could also take a step back and do things a bit differently. I mean, you don't really have that here. I mean, it doesn't really make much of a difference, and it doesn't add anything. And in fact, it just makes the game feel slower. There's no reason for it to really be in there. Whatever. So gameplay-wise, I mean, there's not much to say. It's basically multiplayer, but it functions. It's actually what I think the multiplayer should have been. So, the only thing the campaign could have going for it is this unique tie-in story. And the unique tie-in story I'm given is a character who starts off being interesting, starts off being ruthless, and I don't want to give the impression that there was no way they could have written Eden Versio into being an interesting character who turns to the side of good. I don't want to give that impression. I want to make that clear. There's ways to write stuff, there's ways to write character motivations, character change, that I do not see them doing with any Star Wars material anymore. And that's the one thing I will give credit to the prequels. There was a motivation for Anakin to change. There was a motivation and a very clear motive why he became the man he became. And, you know, people will talk about the prequels and the variety of things, the politics, the emo-ness, the whatever. But I feel like Anakin was really characterized as a human. You really could relate to him on a level that if you really look into it, it makes sense why he wants to do that. He desires power so that injustices cannot come about. And ultimately his storyline is the perversion of those noble and you know, very sensible ideals into the monster that he becomes, and later his redemption and so on and so forth. And then they shit on that in the fourth movie entirely. So episode 7... What? I lost my train of thought. Excuse me. Episode 6 is basically concurrent. You witness the whole Death Star ordeal. And, I mean, it's cool and all, the second Death Star blowing up. There's hero missions sprinkled in for some reason. Why even care? They're just kind of there to play as iconic characters from the film. Like, not Carrie Fisher, excuse me, Princess Leia, and Han Solo, and Luke Skywalker, and for some reason Lando Calrissian, whatever. It happens, you know, whatever. Can't be too picky about it. And, I mean, that's cool and all. I mean, it was fun to play, you know, to break up the monotony. I won't say it's, like, ridiculously great. Nothing will really ever hold a candle, I feel, anymore to Black Ops 2's RTS-style missions, which were so unique and innovative, and I'm surprised that more games have not adopted that since, but whatever. And ultimately, I can't really get into the head of Eden Versio at all. I really can't. I cannot characterize her as someone that is relatable, or as someone that is understandably someone that I would want to sympathize with. I cannot, I'm unable to do that. As unlike other games I played, like I played Assassin's Creed Origins recently, I could definitely get into the mindset of the main character, Bayek, who is, in my opinion, a very relatable character. I played Wolfenstein 2 recently and beat that. I could feel that BJ, you know, while And here's the fun part about it, and BJ Blazkowicz is a character who is it's kind of absurd, you know, that you would say that a character within a movie or within a video game that's just purely about violence and killing is relatable. But I mean, that's kind of the irony of it all. That's kind of the symbolism and the importance of it entirely, is that this man is a very relatable, he's the most relatable person arguably in the entire game. He's very sick of fighting. He doesn't want to fight Nazis anymore, but he feels he has a duty and an obligation to do it. You know, there's parts where he just wishes he could be a quiet father and raise children, and that's very understandable. But by the same notion, they kind of really characterize him in this way that he's in this absurdist plot, and I find that that's one of the most enthralling things about the character. Here, Eden Versio, just her motivations for doing stuff doesn't really matter. The campaign becomes incredibly predictable, and essentially nothing of value is added nor lost to the Star Wars franchise. Now, I am aware of what the tie-in is in Episode 8 to the DLC campaign. This is not a review of the DLC campaign. This is a review of the base game. Now, you could argue since the DLC campaign's free, it's technically a part of the base game, but, I mean, if you really want me to even say anything, I mean, it was fun, I guess. The campaign, the main game is only 4 hours. The DLC is about an hour and a half. So, I mean, sure, if you really want me to say something, there you go. I mean, it's basically more of the same thing you've played, minus any hero missions. It's just made to be a sort of epilogue to the campaign. I won't say it's cut content, because I fundamentally don't think it is. But I'm not going to sit here and say, like, it's the most original and inspiring thing I've ever played or seen in a video game. So I won't. Anyway, I feel that the problem that they have with Episode 7 and Episode 8, and not so much with Rogue One, I just feel Rogue One didn't have time to adequately explore a lot of these themes, but the problem that they have with Episode 7, 8, and this game is that they don't really give these characters good motivations for what they're doing. They don't really characterize them well, and that's a sin of the highest caliber when you're trying to write a character that I should give a flying fuck about. And that's one of the reasons why I think this game kind of falls flat, is that there is essentially no reason for these people to do what they do. And I mean, I know this is kind of, I mean, Eden's sin is that she is not characterized within the character very well. I mean, whatever. You could say a lot. It's a silly fucking first-person shooter campaign. Sure, whatever. It is. So if you want to take that away as your takeaway, then fine. But that is kind of a grander scheme overall with the verdict system that what I use, is that the idea behind a good story is that there's reasons for things to happen and there's reasons for characters to do the things they do, and that's how you end up with characters that you like, is that you find that you sympathize with them, or you know, sometimes depending how realistic it is, you empathize with them, and their logic for doing stuff is justifiable, and you can come to a logical conclusion either based on the laws of our universe or theirs that what they did was in the best interest of their goals, or that, you know, goals change, but at the time of what they know, that's why you like what they do and why you think that it's well done. And here I don't see that. And, you know, by comparison, in Assassin's Creed Origins, I see it all the time in that game, which is why that game, in my opinion, is way infinitely better than it deserves to be. But that's another verdict for another time. There's no real logic, rhyme, or reason to why any of this stuff is happening. It's a silly tie-in. People are going to forget about this campaign very soon. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter. So on a scale, on my usual scale, which I haven't really been around the bush in for a long time, because I've been out of making verdicts, what would I give Star Wars Battlefront 2? Well, given the fact that the campaign is a complete sinker, it completely misses the point of having justifiable characters and reasons and logic, and it's just a generic first-person shooter campaign with a high budget. It doesn't really contribute much at all, and the multiplayer is ass and, you know, basically doesn't work. Has very poor balancing, the star card system, of course, being amongst them. I really was trying to avoid mentioning a lot of this, because, you know, the controversy, and I don't want to sit here and say that my rating is because of the controversy, which is ridiculous in its own right. But I just want to make that clear, that what I'm saying has nothing to do with the controversy. But the star card system, I find, is really just kind of obnoxious. There's no reason for it to be as ass backwards as it is. especially in Starfighter Assault, which you know is going to be very polarizing later on. That's not going to age very well. There's a lot of problems with that, and I think that that's something that, you know, well, should be addressed, but whatever. I mean, that's the way they designed the game. I think it's very piss poor. So yeah, star cards kind of ruin the multiplayer a bit. The heroes, I mean, heroes are whatever. I'm not going to sit here and act like heroes in Battlefront 2, the classic one, you know, weren't ridiculous, because they were. Again, team firing is a very important thing, so at the worst case, you could say that it lends itself to a sort of team play element. There is an element of team play that needs to be addressed, so sure. But the multiplayer itself is kind of shitty. I mean, let's be frank here. It's fucking shitty. There's a lot of poor things about the multiplayer. So I can't give this game a good score. So ultimately, what would I give this game? Well, when I juxtapose it with everything else, I have to give this game a pretty poor ranking. I mean, it's kind of sad, but it's also kind of not. I'm going to give this game a 60 out of 100. And the reason why I give it a 60 out of 100, the thing I will at least give it credit for is that it has a campaign. It looks nice. There's a lot of budget between the various modes. And there's some interesting things on some maps, and there's interesting things, and that's about it. I mean, it's not even anything I would want to write a paper on. It's not anything I would want to really commit to long-term memory. It's just sort of a thing that exists in this universe, in this game, and that's really kind of it. There's not really much else to it. I mean, let's be frank here. There's not really much. It's kind of very simplistic. Like, it's not very well done. And the campaign, which could be a redeeming arc, you know, for a lot of people who like the campaign and a lot of people who enjoy it or whatever, and they love the story and they love the characters and the tie-ins and the this and the mythos and the lore, doesn't really ever get fleshed out here. You could probably snooze on this, and I mean, that's unfortunately the fate of a lot of movie tie-in games. So I'm not going to sit here and say, like, you know, this game should have redefined stuff, but I mean, it really didn't go any higher. One of the best movie tie-in games I've ever played is Into the Matrix. And Into the Matrix, in my opinion, is a very well-done example of what can be done with a lot of budget, with a lot of care, with a lot of love, having the same voice actors as the movie, having the same characters, having live-action sequences featuring the cast of the movie. Say what you will about the gameplay or the third-person mechanics. There's a lot of messed up stuff in the game, but I still respect it for what it did in a time when that wasn't really the thing that was done. You know, movie tie-in games were generally handled by an entirely different group of people who just got the license, who don't secure the voice actors, who don't really care, and, you know, even I have to give credit to Enter the Matrix. I think Enter the Matrix is a way better game than this game. Doesn't have multiplayer, is like a decade and a quarter old game, and I think it's better on almost every conceivable aspect if you're a fan of the respective franchise. So Battlefront 2 is just a mess. It's not a very well done game. I think that the only thing that it really runs on is nostalgia and the fact that the game that came before it didn't even have half of this. It didn't even have different timelines. All it had was the original trilogy and one level in Jakku, and no campaign. Not even a shitty recollection of what happened over the movies. Like, you essentially go into Battlefront 1 being a fan. There's none really else to it, or either just running on the hype train. This time around, where they had so much potential to do so much better, they dropped it on almost every level. Technological, ideological, implementation, you name it, it wasn't that great. Sure, it looks nice occasionally. The multiplayer doesn't. It runs like shit and the balance is all whacked. So, not really much here. It was a waste. A lot of people will say they could tell me it was a waste. You know, I'm pretty good at it. I did promise some friends I'd get it. And I did get it. Whatever. You know, say what you will. I got it for my friends. We played it for a fair bit. And then, you know, maybe we'll play it some more. Probably not. And that's about it. So, that's it for this edition of The Verdict. I'm SpraynPray1000. I mean, if you're a fan of Star Wars, you probably own this game. I just am sharing my opinion here. I think that it's very poorly done in a lot of aspects, and it's a terrible injustice to Star Wars and a terrible, terrible injustice to the namesake on which it carries on. So, I'm SpraynPray1000. I will see you next time for the verdict.